Something that's always bothered me about Jon Snow's Longclaw is the orientation of the pommel. It's a nice design feature that he's got the stark wolf, and particularly as it's white because it looks like his own direwolf, in fact, ghost. But the fact that it points sideways is really quite odd within the context of the design of swords, historically. Now, of course, we have to say Game of Thrones is a fantasy series. However, we don't really know how George Martin conceived this in his mind when he wrote about it in the book, and he doesn't give details about which direction the wolf's head should point in, because obviously that's a pretty small detail to cover in a book. But when the designers of the weapons and the costumes came to make the series, they elected to have the wolf's head pointing sideways. To me, this seems a really strange design choice, because if we look at historical swords such as these, we'll see that when they have animal heads, be they eagles, lions or whatever, they pretty much always point forwards. And the reason for that is ultimately almost certainly related to two things. Firstly, the fact that ergonomically, if you have the chin or beak of an animal projecting forwards, then that gives you a good handle with the lower hand, or single hand if it's a one-handed sword, on the weapon. It gives you a kind of junction on which your little finger sits against. Notice I said little finger there. But it gives you a junction at which the hand sits against, and it actually makes the grip slightly more ergonomic. Lots of sword grips do kind of point this, the pommels point this direction at the bottom anyway. That's the first reason, but the second reason is almost certainly related to European heraldry. Now, we know heraldry plays a really important part in Westeros and in the world conceived by George R.R. Martin, and of course he himself is very well versed in European and, well, world history, and it's very clear that he does know a lot about history and draws upon that heavily in his very well written books. But the reason that the animal heads pretty much always point forwards on swords is quite simply related to heraldry, because on a shield the lions or leopards or eagles or whatever animals they are, generally, if they're going to point one direction or the other, sometimes they point outwards or facing, but usually they're pointing to the left as we look at the shield. And the reason for that is, for a right-handed person, which of course in a medieval type world most people would be forced to be right-handed, and anyway in nature most people are right-handed, an animal on a shield which would be worn on the left arm, you want it to be pointed forwards. If it was pointed backwards, it would look kind of weird. Think about this in heraldic terms. You want your lion rampant, for example, to be facing the enemy. You want it to be pointing forwards. When you're riding your horse, you want its claws and its snarling teeth to be pointing in the direction that you're moving in. You don't want it to be pointing backwards, because then it would be like you were running away and implying that this lion was rampant but turned its back to the enemy. Now, indeed, there might be some cases of shields or heraldry or crests, indeed, where for some specific reason to do with the history of that specific heraldic device, the animal is pointed the other way, or indeed in the case of two-headed animals is sometimes pointed both directions. But generally speaking, statistically, it is far more common for animals to point to the left, which would be pointing forwards when we're wearing a shield on our left arm. So for these two reasons, practicality or ergonomics and heraldry, the animal heads on pommels on swords practically always point forwards. If a sword is double-edged and symmetrical, then they point either left or right, and usually as the sword would be worn at the hip, it would be pointing forwards, just like the heraldry. So Jon Snow's sword, Longclaw, is quite odd for anybody who really is familiar with the design of historical swords. One of the first things that several people I know who are fellow sword collectors and fencers like myself have noticed when they look at Longclaw is, why is the head pointing sideways? It just looks weird. Anyway, there we go. At the end of the day, it is a fantasy sword, and indeed there are some few examples from history where animal heads do point sideways, but it is nevertheless very odd and quite unusual, and I think that Longclaw would have looked like a better, more aggressive, more assertive sword if the head was pointing either left or right. In other words, if it was pointing forwards instead of sideways. As it is at the moment, the lion is looking away from the action. Cheers, folks.